The manager's grip left purple fingerprints on the waitress's forearm as he shoved her into the bathroom. She didn't scream. She couldn't risk losing this job. What they didn't know, the elegant man in the tailored suit who'd been nursing bourbon for 3 hours, was the Vampire King. And he'd just realized why no blood had tempted him in decade. He'd been waiting for hers. Elena Martinez's hands were shaking when she approached table 9 with the Barolo, her third double shift this week blurring the edges of her vision into soft candlelight halos that made depth perception a gamble she was apparently losing. The bottle slipped, just a fraction, just enough for the deep red wine to arc through the air in what felt like slow motion and splash across the white suit jacket of a man whose Rolex probably cost more than her yearly salary. The restaurant went silent except for Sinatra crooning about summer wind and the pounding of Elena's heart, loud enough she thought everyone must hear it. She grabbed napkins with trembling fingers, already apologizing, already calculating that this was her third write-up this month. And 3 strikes meant termination, and termination meant no paycheck, and no paycheck meant her mother's chemotherapy got pushed back again or canceled entirely. The man at table 9 stood abruptly, his face flushed crimson, voice rising about ruined Armani and incompetent staff. And before Elena could grovel her way into maybe keeping her job, Derek Sutton materialized beside her like a predator who'd scented blood in the water. Her manager's fingers clamped around her forearm hard enough that she felt her bones creak, his manicured nails digging into her skin through the thin fabric of her uniform, and he smiled that terrible smile he got when he had an audience and someone to punish. "You stupid little bitch," he hissed low enough that nearby tables couldn't hear. But she felt every word like a slap. "That's the third mistake this week, and maybe some time on your knees scrubbing toilets will teach you to pay attention." He dragged her toward the narrow hallway that led to the staff bathroom, his grip leaving marks she knew would purple by morning, and Elena didn't resist because resistance meant immediate firing, and she couldn't afford pride when her mother's life hung in the balance of minimum wage plus tips. The hallway was dimly lit, away from customer view, the perfect place for Derek to exercise the petty tyranny he called management. And Elena kept her eyes down, because looking at him made her want to scream or cry or both, and she couldn't afford either. "Please, Mr. Sutton," she whispered, as he shoved her against the wall beside the bathroom door. "I'll work an extra shift. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I just can't lose this job. My mom needs the insurance, she needs her treatments, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Derek's hand moved to her shoulder, pushing her down, and Elena's knees were starting to bend when a voice cut through the dim hallway like a blade through silk, calm and cultured, and carrying an edge that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Take your hands off her," the voice said now. What Elena didn't know, couldn't know, was that Damien Thorne had been sitting in booth 7 for exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes, nursing the same 2 fingers of bourbon he'd ordered when he arrived, because vampires didn't get drunk, and the drink was merely a prop in the elaborate theater of appearing human. He'd chosen this restaurant because Antonio Castellano, the owner, asked no questions about customers who only ever ordered drinks and never ate, who always requested the darkest corner booth, who'd been a regular for 15 years without aging a single day. Damien had been reading a first-edition Hemingway, only half paying attention to the dinner rush around him, when Elena walked past his table carrying a tray of wine glasses, and her scent hit him like a physical blow. Jasmine and something warmer, something essentially her, something that made his fingers tighten on the book hard enough that the leather binding cracked. He'd lived 2,000 years, had smelled countless humans, had fed from hundreds in his early centuries before he'd learned control, and not once had a scent affected him like this. His fangs had started to descend before he'd forced them back, his carefully maintained human heartbeat stuttering in his chest, and he'd spent the next 3 hours pretending to read while actually tracking her movement through the restaurant, with senses honed by millennia of hunting. Every time she passed his booth, the jasmine scent got stronger, layered now with exhaustion and anxiety and the faint copper tang of a split lip she'd worried with her teeth. Damien had watched her smile at customers with a warmth that never reached her tired eyes, had listened to her deflect a drunk businessman's advances with practiced grace, had noticed the way she favored her left foot like her shoes didn't fit right and she couldn't afford new ones. When the wine spilled and the man at table 9 started shouting, Damien's hands had clenched into fists beneath the table because the spike of Elena's fear scent made every predatory instinct in his body roar to life. Then Derek Sutton appeared, and the manager's fingers wrapped around Elena's arm, and Damien smelled the sharp metallic spike of her pain as Derek squeezed hard enough to bruise, and 2,000 years of iron control shattered like glass. He was on his feet before his conscious mind registered the decision, the book falling forgotten to the table, his body moving with the fluid grace that came from centuries of being an apex predator. The other diners looked up as he stood, some primitive part of their hindbrains recognizing danger even if their conscious minds couldn't name it, and the ambient noise in the restaurant dropped several decibels. Damien crossed the space between his booth and the hallway in seconds, not quite using vampire speed but faster than a human should move, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the tile floor. He could hear Elena's heartbeat from here, rabbiting with fear and humiliation, could smell the salt of tears she was fighting not to shed, could hear Derek's elevated pulse that spoke of anger and aroused cruelty. The hallway was narrow and dark, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast shadows across Derek's face as he pushed Elena toward her knees, and Damien felt his fangs descend fully for the first time in 50 years. He forced them back with an effort that made his jaw ache, forced his eyes to remain human brown instead of the crimson that wanted to bleed through, forced himself to speak calmly instead of ripping this pathetic excuse for a man limb from limb. "Take your hands off her," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command that came from 2 millennia of rulership now. Derek spun around, his grip on Elena loosening slightly, and Damien watched the manager's pupils dilate as some animal part of his brain processed threat signals his conscious mind couldn't interpret. Derek's mouth opened, probably to deliver some dismissive comment about minding your own business. But the words died when he met Damien's eyes, because Damien had stopped trying quite so hard to look human, and there was something in his gaze that made grown men remember what it felt like to be prey. Elena was frozen against the wall, her arms still bearing the red marks of Derek's fingers, her dark eyes wide as she looked between the 2 men. Damien could hear her pulse starting to slow from panic to confusion, could smell the shift in her scent from pure fear to something more complex, and when her gaze landed on him, he felt the mate bond snap into place with enough force that he actually staggered back a step. It was impossible. Fated mates were myths even among vampires, stories from the old country that the elders told to explain obsession, and Damien had lived long enough to watch civilizations rise and fall without ever feeling even a whisper of recognition. But this was unmistakable. This thrumming certainty in his dead chest that this exhausted waitress with her cheap shoes and split lip and jasmine scent was his, had always been his, would always be his. The bond sang in his veins like electricity, like coming home after a 1,000-year exile, and every possessive instinct he'd spent centuries learning to control howled mine, mine, mine. Derek was talking now, his voice rising in bluster and indignation. Something about "this is my restaurant and that clumsy idiot works for me, and who the hell do you think you are?" But Damien barely heard him over the roaring in his ears. He took a step forward, then another, positioning himself between Derek and Elena with a deliberateness that made the manager back up despite himself. "This is Antonio Castellano's restaurant," Damien said softly. "You're merely an employee, and I think you'll find that Antonio values my patronage considerably more than your management." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but clear, and behind him he heard Elena's sharp intake of breath. "Please, sir," she said, her voice shaking. "I appreciate this, but I can't afford to make trouble. I'll just apologize and take whatever punishment Mr. Sutton thinks is appropriate. I need this job. I can't lose it." The desperation in her voice made something crack in Damien's chest, made him turn to look at her fully for the first time, and the mate bond flared so bright he could barely breathe. "You will apologize for nothing," he heard himself say, his voice rougher than intended. "Do you understand me? Nothing." Elena's lips parted in surprise, her eyes searching his face for some explanation for why a stranger would defend her, and Damien knew in that moment that everything in his very long life had been leading to this dingy hallway in a Seattle restaurant where a frightened waitress smelled like jasmine and looked at him like he might be either salvation or damnation. Derek's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat, his bravado crumbling as every survival instinct he possessed started screaming warnings his conscious mind couldn't quite process. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he managed to sputter, his voice climbing an octave as he tried to reassert dominance through volume alone. "This is my restaurant, and that clumsy idiot works for me, and I don't care how much money you spend on overpriced bourbon. You don't get to tell me how to discipline my staff." Damien remained perfectly still, his body positioned between Derek and Elena with a deliberateness that looked casual but was anything but, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and cultured and somehow more terrifying than any shout could be. "This is Antonio Castellano's restaurant," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "You're merely an employee, and I think you'll find that Antonio values my patronage considerably more than your management skills." The threat hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but unmistakable, and Damien watched Derek's pupils dilate as some primitive part of his brain recognized predator, even if his ego refused to acknowledge it. Behind him, Damien could hear Elena's elevated heartbeat, could smell the confusion mixing with her fear scent, could feel her eyes on his back like a physical touch. Derek's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists, and Damien recognized the exact moment when wounded pride overrode self-preservation because he'd seen it countless times over 2 millennia and humans were always so predictable in their stupidity. "You don't know who you're messing with," Derek snarled, reaching past Damien toward Elena like he intended to drag her out of the hallway and finish what he'd started, and Damien's hand shot out faster than human eye could follow and caught Derek's wrist mid-reach. The manager's forward momentum stopped instantly, his arm arrested in mid-air, and Damien applied just enough pressure that the bones in Derek's wrist creaked audibly in the sudden silence. Derek's face went gray, his mouth opening in a soundless gasp, and Damien leaned in close enough that his next words would reach only Derek's ears. "Touch her again," he whispered with perfect calm, "and they'll find pieces of you in 3 different states. Do we understand each other?" It wasn't a question. Derek nodded frantically, his whole body trembling now, and Damien released his wrist with a small smile that showed no teeth but somehow conveyed endless threat. The scent of Elena's blood was driving Damien insane. That split on her lower lip, where she'd worried it earlier, now reopened from stress, just a single drop of copper threading through the jasmine and fear. But to a vampire as old and powerful as Damien, it might as well have been a symphony. His fangs were threatening to descend again, his carefully maintained human facade cracking at the edges, and he channeled the overwhelming urge to bite and claim and bond into cold fury directed at the pathetic man cowering before him. Behind him, Elena made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, and Damien's entire body tensed because every instinct screamed that his mate was in distress, and the thing causing that distress needed to die immediately. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to maintain control, forced himself to remember that ripping Derek's throat out in front of 50 witnesses would create complications that even his considerable wealth and influence couldn't easily smooth over. "Please, sir," Elena's voice came from behind him, shaking but trying for steadiness. "I appreciate this, but I can't afford to make trouble. I'll just apologize to the customer and accept whatever punishment Mr. Sutton thinks is appropriate. I really need this job and I can't lose it." The words hit Damien like physical blows, the desperation in her voice making something crack in his chest, and he turned to look at her fully for the first time since entering the hallway. She was pressed against the wall, her dark eyes too wide in a face that was trying for neutral but couldn't quite hide the fear and exhaustion, her arm already showing the purple fingerprint bruises from Derek's grip, her cheap polyester uniform hanging on a frame that was too thin because she probably skipped meals to afford her mother's medications. The mate bond surged so powerfully that Damien actually swayed on his feet, 2,000 years of iron control evaporating in the face of this fragile human woman who smelled like jasmine and looked at him with desperate hope, like maybe he could fix this, even though she'd learned long ago not to count on anyone. "You will apologize for nothing," he heard himself say, his voice rougher and more intense than he'd intended. "Do you understand me? Nothing." Something ancient and possessive flashed through him, some primal claiming instinct that transcended species and civilization, and he saw Elena's breath catch as their eyes met and held. The restaurant beyond the hallway had gone quiet, that particular silence that falls when something dramatic is unfolding and everyone wants to hear without appearing to eavesdrop. Damien could hear the bartender's hands stilling on the glass he'd been polishing, could hear the whispered conversations of waitstaff clustering near the kitchen doors, could hear the sharp intake of breath from the hostess stand. The air had gone thick with tension, charged like the moment before lightning strikes, and Damien knew his supernatural presence was leaking through despite his best efforts to contain it. Sensitive humans would feel it as pressure, as warning, as the certainty that something dangerous stood among them even if they couldn't name what. The kitchen doors swung open and Antonio Castellano emerged, his white chef's coat still spotless despite the dinner rush, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the swift calculation of a man who'd survived 40 years in the restaurant business by knowing when to pick his battles. He'd known Damien for 15 years, ever since the vampire had appeared one night requesting a corner booth and the discretion to sit for hours without ordering food, and Antonio had taken one look at the stranger's old eyes and expensive suit and made the decision that some customers were worth accommodating without questions. Over the years, he'd noticed that Damien never aged, never ate, always paid in cash that smelled faintly of old paper and vault storage, and was unfailingly polite to staff while radiating the kind of danger that made drunk customers sober up fast. Antonio had also noticed that the people Damien mentioned in passing tended to be wealthy beyond measure and connected to networks that made problems disappear, and he'd built a very successful business on knowing which customers could end you and which could elevate you. He took one look at Damien standing between Derek and the waitress, at Derek's white face and cradled wrist, at the way the air seemed to vibrate with suppressed violence, and made his calculation in under 3 seconds. "Mr. Thorne," Antonio said smoothly, moving into the hallway with the confident stride of a man on his own territory. "I apologize for any disturbance to your evening. Please allow me to comp your tab and offer you our private dining room for your next visit." Derek started to sputter something about this being an internal staff matter, but Antonio cut him off with a gesture. "Derek, my office, now. We need to discuss your future with this establishment." The words were mild, but the tone was iron, and Derek's face went from gray to red as he realized he was being fired in front of the staff he'd terrorized for 3 years. "But she spilled wine on a VIP customer," he protested weakly. "She needs to be disciplined. I was just doing my job as manager." Antonio's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Your job as manager does not include leaving bruises on my employees," he said quietly. "Now go to my office and wait for me. We'll discuss your severance." Derek looked like he wanted to argue, his gaze darting between Antonio and Damien, but whatever he saw in their faces made his remaining courage evaporate, and he slunk toward the office like a beaten dog. The silence stretched for a beat, then 2, before Antonio turned to Elena with an expression of genuine concern. "Miss Martinez, are you all right? Do you need medical attention for your arm?" Elena shook her head mutely, still pressed against the wall, her eyes tracking Damien like she couldn't quite believe he was real. "I'm fine, Mr. Castellano," she managed. "I'm sorry about the wine. I'll pay for the customer's dry cleaning and work extra shifts to cover the bottle." Antonio waved this away impatiently. The customer was already drunk and looking for a reason to cause a scene. I was about to comp his meal and ask him to leave. "You did nothing wrong." He glanced at Damien, some unspoken communication passing between them, then continued. "Take the rest of the night off, with pay, and come see me tomorrow to discuss a raise. I've been meaning to promote you to senior server anyway." Elena's mouth opened in shock, her eyes welling with tears. She blinked back furiously, and Damien felt the mate bond pulse with her overwhelming relief and gratitude and confusion. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I don't know what to say." Antonio smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face. "Say you'll stop skipping lunch breaks and actually eat the staff meals I provide. You're making my kitchen look bad when you're too thin to properly show off our good cooking." It was said with warmth, with the gruff affection of a man who noticed more than he let on, and Elena managed a watery laugh. Behind them, the normal sounds of the restaurant were resuming. Waiters moving again, conversations starting back up, the moment of drama passing into gossip that would fuel break-room conversations for weeks. Damien knew he should leave, should step back and let Elena process without his overwhelming presence, but when he tried to move his feet, refused to cooperate because the mate bond was screaming that his mate was hurt and scared and he needed to stay and protect and provide. Elena's hand reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing his arm, and even through the expensive fabric of his suit jacket, the contact sent electricity racing up his spine. "Please," she said softly. "You don't have to do this. I appreciate your help, but you don't have to get involved. I know how to handle men like Derek." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they broke something in Damien's chest because they meant she'd had to handle men like Derek before, meant this wasn't the first time someone had hurt her, meant she'd learned to expect cruelty and minimize it and survive it alone. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his fingers cool against her warmth, and he felt her pulse jump at the contact. "I'm already involved," he said quietly, and knew with earth-shattering clarity that it was true, that from the moment her jasmine scent had hit him across a crowded restaurant, his involvement had been inevitable and irrevocable, that this fragile human woman with her bruised arm and split lip and desperate courage was his fated mate, and he would burn the world down before he let anyone hurt her again. Antonio didn't waste time with formalities or severance negotiations. He simply told Derek to collect his things and leave the premises immediately, or he'd call the police and press charges for assault. And Derek's face cycled through disbelief and rage before settling on sullen defeat as he slunk out through the kitchen entrance with every server watching in satisfied silence. After he'd gone, Antonio turned to Elena, with an expression somewhere between fatherly concern and businessman pragmatism, asking if she wanted to file a police report or pursue legal action because he had security footage and would support her fully. But Elena just shook her head because she knew how these things went, and poor waitresses didn't win lawsuits against men who could afford lawyers, and she just wanted to forget the whole thing and keep her job. Antonio looked like he wanted to argue, but instead told her again to take the night off with pay and report tomorrow for a discussion about her promotion, then disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving Elena alone in the hallway with Damien. The silence stretched between them, charged with something Elena couldn't name, and she became acutely aware that this stranger had just upended her entire evening and possibly saved her job, and she didn't even know his name. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steadier now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. Derek's been looking for an excuse to fire me for months." Damien's dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, not uncomfortable exactly, but overwhelming, like being seen in a way she wasn't used to. "It was my pleasure," he said, his cultured voice doing something strange to her nervous system. Men who abuse their power over vulnerable employees deserve far worse than unemployment. There was something in the way he said it, some hint of threat beneath the civilized words, that made Elena remember the sound of Derek's bones creaking and the way this elegant stranger had moved too fast and held too still. Before she could examine that thought too closely, Damien reached into his jacket and produced a business card that looked expensive, heavy cream stock with elegant script. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Martinez," he said, extending the card. "I find myself in need of a personal assistant, and I believe you would be perfectly suited for the position." Elena took the card automatically, her fingers brushing his, and the contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and rare. The card read, "Damien Thorne, Private Investments," with a phone number and email address but no physical location, and when Elena looked up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "The pay would be triple your current salary," he continued, "plus comprehensive health insurance that would cover pre-existing conditions and family members. The hours are flexible, and the work itself is primarily organizational, correspondence, and research." It sounded too good to be true, which in Elena's experience meant it absolutely was, and she felt the familiar wariness that came from being a young woman alone in a city where men with money thought everything had a price. "What kind of research?" she asked carefully, keeping her voice neutral. "And what exactly would my duties entail?" Damien's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "Nothing untoward, I assure you," he said. "I acquire rare books and artifacts for private collectors. The work involves cataloging, authentication research, and coordinating with auction houses and estates, entirely legitimate and thoroughly boring by most standards." It sounded legitimate, almost disappointingly so, but Elena had been poor long enough to know that rich men didn't offer desperate waitresses dream jobs out of altruism. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thorne," she said slowly, handing back the card. "But I don't think it would be appropriate. You don't know anything about me, and I don't know anything about you. And honestly, this feels like the kind of situation my mother warned me about." She watched his face for anger or offense, but instead saw something that looked almost like respect, his dark eyes warming slightly. "Your mother raised you well," he said, accepting the card back, "though I assure you my intentions are entirely professional. However, I understand your hesitation and won't press the matter." He slipped the card back into his jacket, then did something unexpected. He pulled out a second card and wrote something on the back before offering it again. "My direct number," he said. "If you change your mind, or if you ever need assistance with anything at all, please don't hesitate to call." Elena took the second card more slowly, surprised by the genuine offer with no apparent strings attached, and when she met his eyes, she saw something there that made her breath catch, something ancient and lonely and wanting that didn't match his polished exterior. She didn't call, but Damien appeared at the restaurant the next night and requested her section, settling into the same corner booth with another book and that same glass of bourbon he never seemed to actually drink. Elena served him with professional courtesy, taking his order for spaghetti carbonara that he barely touched, refilling his water glass that never emptied, and trying to ignore the way her skin hummed whenever she came near his table. He left a tip that was larger than her entire night's wages, crisp hundreds tucked under his untouched dessert plate, and she almost ran after him to give it back before Antonio caught her arm and told her to take it because Mr. Thorne could afford it, and she'd earned it. The second night was the same, booth 7, bourbon, carbonara, enormous tip. Except this time when she refilled his water. He asked her about the small paint stain on her wrist, and she found herself telling him about the canvas she'd been working on in stolen hours between shifts. Nothing special. Just a hobby, really. His interest seemed genuine, not the polite feigning of a man trying to get into her pants, and when he asked what she painted, she heard herself describing the half-finished piece in her apartment, an abstract thing in blues and grays that was supposed to capture what exhaustion felt like. You should paint what joy feels like, he'd said quietly, so you remember it exists. The third night he brought a book, not to read but to show her, a first edition Hemingway with the author's signature and marginalia, and he let her turn the fragile pages with her paint-stained fingers while he explained the story of how he'd acquired it from an estate sale in Paris. The fourth night, Elena finally asked the question that had been building. "Why are you really here?" she said as she set down his untouched carbonara. "Men like you don't eat spaghetti 4 nights in a row just because you like the ambiance." Damien looked up from his book, his dark eyes meeting hers with that unsettling intensity. "Perhaps I've developed an appreciation for the service," he said, and the way he said service made it clear he meant her specifically, not the restaurant, and Elena felt heat climb her neck. She should have been annoyed or uncomfortable, but instead found herself looking forward to his appearances, found herself wondering what he'd talk about tonight, found herself disappointed on the fifth night when booth 7 remained empty until 10 minutes before her shift ended, and she'd almost given up hope before he appeared looking slightly disheveled in a way that shouldn't have been attractive, but absolutely was. "My apologies for the late arrival," he said, as she brought water without being asked. "I was detained by business. Have you eaten dinner?" The question surprised her, because customers didn't usually ask servers about their meals, and she admitted that no, she'd been too busy and would grab something after her shift. He frowned slightly. "Join me," he said. "Order whatever you'd like and take your break, I insist." Antonio would never allow it. Fraternizing with customers was grounds for termination. But when she glanced toward the kitchen, her boss was watching with an expression of calculation and gave her a subtle nod. So Elena found herself sliding into the booth across from Damien Thorne, acutely aware that every server in the restaurant was staring, and ordered the chicken marsala she never let herself get because it was expensive. They talked for an hour, the conversation flowing easier than it should have between a waitress and a wealthy stranger, and Elena found herself confessing things she normally kept private. "I used to paint seriously," she said, picking at her chicken. "Before my mom got sick, I was going to apply to RISD. I had a portfolio ready and everything. But then the cancer diagnosis came, and suddenly I was choosing between art school and keeping her alive." "Dreams are expensive luxuries when someone you love is dying," she continued, her voice going flat in the way it did when she talked about her mother's illness. "So I work double shifts and paint when I can, and try not to think about what might have been." Damien's expression shifted into something that looked like genuine pain, his long fingers tight around his glass. "Dreams deferred are not dreams destroyed," he said quietly, merely waiting. "And when your mother recovers, you'll paint again, better than before, because suffering teaches perspective that privilege cannot." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but something had changed between them. Some wall had come down. And when Damien walked her to her bus stop that night because Seattle at midnight wasn't safe for young women alone, Elena didn't protest. The rain had started, that fine Seattle mist that wasn't quite precipitation, but left everything gleaming and wet. And Damien produced an umbrella that probably cost more than her rent. They stood at the bus shelter, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something expensive and subtle with notes of cedar, and something darker, and she realized she was staring at the line of his jaw. "What do you really want from me, Mr. Thorne?" she heard herself ask. "Because I've been poor my whole life, and I know men don't give without expecting to receive. So what is it you're after?" She'd meant it to sound confrontational, but it came out curious, genuinely wanting to know, and Damien turned to face her fully in the glow of the streetlight. "Your time," he said with devastating honesty, "your thoughts, your trust if you'll give it, nothing you're unwilling to offer." The answer should have been smooth, rehearsed, but it sounded raw somehow, like the words cost him something to say. "I'm not offering employment as some elaborate seduction, Elena," he continued, using her first name for the first time and sending a shiver down her spine. I'm offering it because you're clearly intelligent and capable and wasted on a job that doesn't appreciate you. And yes, selfishly, because I enjoy your company and would like more of it. But the choice is entirely yours, with no pressure or expectations beyond professional competence. Her bus was coming, she could see the lights approaching through the rain, but Elena couldn't make herself move. I'll think about it, she said finally, and saw something that looked like relief flash across his perfect features. What Elena didn't know, couldn't know, was that Damien returned to his downtown penthouse after each encounter and spent hours pacing like a caged predator, fighting instincts that demanded he simply take what was his by right of the mate bond. He'd lived 2,000 years, had commanded armies and toppled kingdoms, and bent the supernatural world to his will through force and cunning, and now found himself completely undone by a human waitress who looked at him with wariness and cautious hope. His second in command, Marcus had noticed the change immediately, had watched his king become distracted and irritable, and obsessed with a scent that clung to his clothes. When Damien finally explained about the mate bond, Marcus had gone very still because fated mates were myths and legends, and finding one meant everything changed. The vampire had immediately begun investigating Elena's life with the thoroughness that came from 6 centuries of intelligence work, and the report he delivered made Damien's hands clench into fists. Medical debt approaching 6 figures from her mother's cancer treatments, rent 2 months overdue with an eviction notice already filed, a car that barely ran, and student loans from a single semester at community college before she'd had to drop out. Marcus had watched his king's face cycle through rage and pain and fierce protectiveness before settling into cold determination. Pay the medical bills, Damien had ordered, anonymously. Make it look like a charity or insurance correction, and buy her building. I want that eviction notice withdrawn immediately. Marcus had raised an eyebrow but complied because he'd never seen Damien like this, vulnerable and desperate, and trying so hard to do the right thing instead of just taking what he wanted. The building was acquired within 24 hours, a shell corporation purchasing it from the slumlord owner, and Elena's eviction notice disappeared from her door along with a note about rent reduction due to new ownership policies. Damien had Marcus arrange for her mother's next round of chemotherapy to be covered by a pharmaceutical trial that didn't actually exist, just more anonymous intervention that would never be traced back to him. He was trying to court her properly, to give her reasons to choose him that weren't based on supernatural bonds or financial desperation. But every day the mate bond grew stronger, and his control grew thinner, and he knew eventually something would have to break. The call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, Elena's phone buzzing against the milk crate she used as a nightstand, and she knew before answering that it was the hospital, because good news never came at 3 a.m., and her mother's oncologist had warned her that the next crisis could be the last. Dr. Patel's voice was professionally sympathetic as she explained that Maria Martinez had crashed during the night, her white blood cell count dropping to critical levels, and the standard treatments weren't working anymore. But there was an experimental immunotherapy trial that showed promise, except it cost $75,000, and insurance wouldn't cover experimental treatments, and they needed a decision within 48 hours, or they'd have to move Maria to palliative care, which was a clinical way of saying they'd make her comfortable while she died. Elena sat on the edge of her mattress on the floor, staring at the half-finished painting on her easel, blues and grays that were supposed to represent exhaustion, but now just looked like surrender, and did the math she'd done 100 times before. She had $437 in her checking account, another $200 in tips hidden in a coffee can. Her car was worth maybe $1,000 if she could find a buyer. And even if she sold everything she owned and worked every shift available for the next month, she'd still be $70,000 short with only 48 hours to find it. The desperation was a physical weight in her chest, crushing her ribs, making it hard to breathe. And she thought about Damien Thorne's business card still tucked in her apron pocket, his elegant handwriting on the back with his direct number and the words, "Call anytime." She'd been avoiding taking his job offer for 2 weeks now, had convinced herself that accepting help from a man she barely knew was dangerous, that the way he looked at her meant complications she couldn't afford, that mixing gratitude with attraction was a recipe for disaster. But her mother was dying, and pride was a luxury for people who had options, and Elena had exactly none. She called the number at 3:15 a.m., her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone, and Damien answered on the second ring, with no trace of sleep in his voice like he'd been waiting for her call. "Miss Martinez," he said, his cultured accent somehow even more pronounced over the phone. "What's wrong?" The fact that he knew immediately that something was wrong, that he didn't ask why she was calling in the middle of the night, made Elena's throat close up with emotions she couldn't name. She told him everything in a rush, the words tumbling out between gasping breaths that might have been sobs, about her mother's crash and the experimental treatment, and the $75,000 she didn't have, and the 48-hour deadline that might as well have been 48 seconds for all the good it did her. "I know I haven't accepted your job offer," she said when she finally ran out of words. "And I know this is insane and inappropriate, but I'm out of options and I'll do whatever you want, assistant or companion or I don't even care. Just please, if you could loan me the money, I'll pay you back. I swear, I'll work for you for free if that's what it takes. I just can't lose her. She's all I have left." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 heartbeats, 4, and Elena squeezed her eyes shut against the tears that were coming anyway. "Come to my office," Damien said finally, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before, something like fury but not directed at her. "I'll text you the address. Come now and we'll handle this." He hung up before she could thank him or question him or talk herself out of it. And 30 seconds later, her phone buzzed with an address in the financial district and a second text that just said, "I'm sending a car." Elena wanted to protest that she could take the bus, that she didn't need special treatment, but the bus didn't run at 3:30 a.m., and pride was still a luxury she couldn't afford. So she pulled on jeans and the nicest sweater she owned, and was waiting on the curb when a black town car pulled up, driven by a man who introduced himself as Marcus, and looked at her with an expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. The drive took 15 minutes through empty Seattle streets, rain starting to fall in sheets that turned the city into a blur of neon and streetlights, and Marcus didn't try to make conversation, which Elena appreciated, because she was using all her energy to hold herself together. The building was all glass and steel, aggressively modern, and the elevator required a key card that Marcus provided before telling her to take it to the penthouse and that Mr. Thorne was expecting her. The elevator opened directly into an office that looked like something from an architecture magazine, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, minimalist furniture in blacks and grays, and yet somehow warmer than it should have been because of the books. They were everywhere, lining custom shelves, stacked on the massive desk, first editions in protective cases that Elena recognized, even from across the room, as valuable beyond measure. Damien stood at the windows with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up like he'd been working all night. And when he turned to face her, Elena saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. He looked furious, not at her, but for her, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that should have been frightening, but instead made her feel seen and valued and protected. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said without preamble. "You shouldn't have to trade your autonomy for your mother's life. The fact that your healthcare system forces this choice is obscene." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware that she was standing in a penthouse office at 4 a.m. in her cheapest clothes, about to sell herself to a man she barely knew. "But here I am anyway," she said, trying for pragmatic and landing somewhere near broken. "So let's talk terms. How long do I have to work for you to pay back $75,000? What exactly would my duties entail? And please just be honest about what you expect, because I need to know what I'm agreeing to." Damien crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, stopping just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Sit," he said gently, gesturing to the leather chair behind his desk. And when she obeyed, he pulled out a checkbook from the desk drawer, the kind that looked like it came from a private bank that only served people with 8-figure accounts. He wrote with quick, decisive strokes, tore out the check, and placed it on the desk in front of her. $75,000 made out to Swedish Medical Center, with a note line that read, "For the treatment of Maria Martinez." Elena stared at the casual way he'd just written a check that would save her mother's life, and felt something crack in her chest. "I'll draft an employment contract," she started, her voice shaking. "We can structure the repayment as deductions from my salary over whatever timeline works. I can start immediately and work whatever hours you need." Damien's hand came down on the desk, not hard, but firm enough to make her look up, and what she saw in his face stopped her words in her throat. "No," he said quietly. "This is a gift, not a transaction. Your mother will receive the treatment, and you owe me nothing." Elena's brain couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. People didn't just give away $75,000 to near strangers with no expectation of return. "That's not how this works," she protested. "You don't even know me. Why would you just give me this kind of money? What do you want from me?" The question came out sharper than intended, edged with desperation and confusion, and Damien moved around the desk to crouch in front of her chair so they were eye level. "I don't want your desperation, Elena," he said, each word carefully enunciated. "I don't want you agreeing to work for me because you have no choice. I don't want you in my life because you owe me a debt. I want—" He stopped, his jaw clenching like he was fighting for control. "I want you to choose me freely or not at all." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Elena didn't fully understand, and she felt tears start to slip down her cheeks unchecked. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Damien's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears, and his touch was cool against her overheated skin. "Don't I?" he said softly, and Elena realized he was right. They'd spent 2 weeks talking across a restaurant table, sharing stories and dreams and fears, and she knew him in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with connection. She knew he loved Hemingway, but thought Fitzgerald was overrated, that he'd lost someone important centuries ago, though he never said who, that he looked at art like other people looked at mathematical equations, searching for the underlying structure. She knew his hands were always cool, that he never ate the food he ordered, that sometimes when he looked at her, his eyes seemed to glow in the candlelight, though that had to be her imagination. The kiss happened without conscious decision, Elena leaning forward and Damien meeting her halfway. And the moment their lips touched, she felt something click into place like a lock finding its key. He tasted like mint and something darker, something that should have been wrong but felt utterly right. And when his arms came around her, she made a sound that was half sob, half sigh, and pressed closer. The mate bond surged between them like electricity, like coming home, and Damien growled low in his throat as every instinct he possessed screamed, "Mine, mine, mine." He could taste the salt of her tears, could feel the thundering of her very human, very fragile heartbeat against his chest, could smell the jasmine and grief and desperate hope that made her scent uniquely Elena. His fangs descended without permission, the urge to bite and claim and bond them together so overwhelming that his hands shook with the effort of restraint. One bite and she'd be his forever, marked and mated, the bond strengthened beyond anything humans could comprehend. One bite and he'd never have to fear losing her. One bite and he'd be exactly the monster he'd spent centuries proving he wasn't. He pulled back with effort that left him gasping, his forehead resting against hers, his hands cupping her face like she was something precious and breakable. "Elena," he said hoarsely, "there are things you need to know about me before this goes any further, things that will change how you see me." She was still crying but smiling too, her hands fisted in his shirt. "I feel like I've known you forever," she whispered. "How is that possible? Why does this feel so right?" "Because you're mine," Damien wanted to say. Because fate or destiny or biology decided 2,000 years ago that you would be born for me and I would wait for you. Instead, he said, "Come to dinner tomorrow night. Let me show you who I really am, then decide if forever is something you want." The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread below them like a carpet of lights, and Elena felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and irrevocable. She should ask questions, should demand explanations for why a venture capitalist worked only at night and never aged, and looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for millennia. She should be frightened by the intensity in his eyes, by the possessiveness in the way he touched her, by the fact that he'd just given her $75,000 like it was pocket change. Instead, she felt safe, cherished, seen in a way she'd never experienced, and when she nodded agreement to dinner, she saw relief and terror and fierce joy flash across his perfect features. He drove her to the hospital himself, the black sports car eating up the rain-slicked streets, and waited in the parking lot while she delivered the check to the night administrator, who looked at it like it might be fake before running it through 3 different verification systems. Dr. Patel appeared within 20 minutes, surprised and relieved, explaining that they could start the treatment immediately if Elena consented. Her mother was unconscious, her skin gray against the white hospital sheets, tubes and monitors tracking her decline, and Elena held her hand and whispered that it was going to be okay. That help had come from an unexpected source, that she needed to fight just a little longer. When she returned to the car, Damien was on his phone speaking rapid Italian to someone named Marcus about acquiring a pharmaceutical company and ensuring priority access to experimental treatments, and he ended the call the moment he saw her. "She's getting the treatment," Elena said, and then she was crying again, great heaving sobs of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude, and Damien pulled her against his chest and held her while she fell apart. His hand stroked her hair with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his dangerous elegance, and he murmured something in a language she didn't recognize but that sounded like comfort and promises. When she finally pulled back, embarrassed by the wet spot on his expensive shirt, he tilted her face up with 2 fingers under her chin. "Tomorrow night," he said, 7 o'clock, "I'll send Marcus to pick you up." Elena wanted to argue that she could drive herself, but her car had finally died completely last week, and she was too tired to protest. She nodded, and Damien's thumb brushed across her lower lip with a reverence that made her shiver. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Everything else can wait until tomorrow." Marcus picked Elena up at 6:30 in the same black town car, his expression carefully neutral as he held the door and mentioned that the drive would take 40 minutes because Mr. Thorne's estate was outside the city limits. The Seattle suburbs gave way to dense forest, the road winding through Douglas firs that grew so thick they blocked out the fading daylight. And when they finally turned onto a private drive, Elena saw the mansion rising from the trees like something transplanted from another century, because it absolutely had been. Gothic revival architecture in gray stone, turrets and arched windows and gargoyles perched on the corners, looking less like a home and more like a castle that had somehow ended up in Washington state. Marcus caught her expression in the rearview mirror, and his lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "Mr. Thorne has eclectic taste in real estate," he said, which was possibly the understatement of the century. And then they were pulling up to the front entrance where Damien stood waiting in charcoal slacks and a black sweater that made him look both dangerously elegant and somehow more approachable than his usual suits. He opened her door himself, Marcus driving away to some unseen garage, and when Damien extended his hand to help her out, Elena noticed his fingers were trembling slightly. "You're nervous," she said with surprise, and watched something vulnerable flash across his perfect features. "Terrified, actually," he admitted, leading her up the stone steps. "I've faced armies and assassins and the collapse of empires with less fear than I feel right now about this conversation." The honesty disarmed her, made her feel less alone in her own anxiety, and she squeezed his hand as they entered a foyer that took her breath away with its soaring ceilings and the tapestries that looked genuinely medieval, because they were. Dinner was laid out in a formal dining room that could have seated 30 but was set intimately for two. Candlelight reflecting off crystal and silver that looked antique because everything in this house was antique, including possibly the owner, though Elena tried not to examine that thought too closely. Damien had somehow remembered every food preference she'd mentioned in passing over 2 weeks of conversation. The first course was butternut squash soup that she'd told him reminded her of her grandmother's cooking. The main was coq au vin, that she'd said was her favorite meal even though she could never afford it, and the wine was a Bordeaux from 1947 that probably cost more than her car had. He barely touched his food again, she noticed, just moved it around his plate while watching her eat with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but instead felt like being cherished. They talked about everything and nothing. About the art on the walls that Damien casually mentioned commissioning from painters she'd studied in art history, about the books in his library that included original manuscripts from authors dead for centuries, and Elena found herself relaxing despite the growing certainty that nothing about this situation was normal. When dessert was finished, creme brulee that cracked perfectly under her spoon, Damien stood and extended his hand. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There's something I need to show you." They moved through the mansion, and Elena tried not to gape at the casual wealth on display. The weapons mounted on walls that looked genuinely used in actual battles. The paintings that would make museum curators weep. The furniture that spanned styles from Baroque to mid-century modern, like the owner had been collecting for lifetimes plural. They ended up in a library that made her art school dreams look pathetic. 3 stories of books with a spiral staircase and rolling ladders, first editions behind glass and manuscripts on pedestals, and texts in languages Elena didn't recognize. "This is beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers along a shelf, and Damien's voice behind her was rough with some emotion she couldn't name. "Elena," he said, "before this goes any further, I need to tell you what I am, and I need you to understand that everything I'm about to say is true, no matter how impossible it sounds." She turned to face him, saw the tension in every line of his body, saw the way his hands were clenched at his sides like he was fighting for control. "Okay," she said carefully, and Damien closed his eyes like he was gathering courage, which seemed absurd for a man who radiated confidence. "I'm a vampire," he said bluntly. "I was born in Rome 2,000 years ago, when Caesar Augustus ruled. I've lived through the fall of empires and the rise of nations. I've killed more people than I can count, though not in recent centuries. And I am currently the vampire king of the North American covens, which means I have power and responsibilities you can't begin to imagine." The words hung in the air between them, and Elena's first instinct was to laugh because obviously he was joking. Vampires weren't real, they were fiction and folklore and bad movies. But Damien wasn't laughing. His dark eyes were deadly serious. And when he took a step toward her, she found herself backing up until she hit the bookshelf. "I am what your species invented horror stories to explain," he continued, his voice dropping to something almost hypnotic. "I have toppled empires and built new ones. I have walked through history as kingdoms rose and fell. I am not safe, Elena. I am a predator who has spent 2,000 years learning to pass as human." He moved faster than her eyes could track, suddenly across the room, then back in front of her before she could blink, and Elena's rational mind stuttered because people couldn't move like that. His eyes began to glow, not metaphorically, but actually glow, crimson bleeding through the dark brown like backlit rubies, and when he smiled, she saw fangs descend where his canines should be, sharp and white and obviously real. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst, her fight-or-flight response screaming "flight, flight, flight," and some distant part of her mind was trying to process that vampires were real, which meant everything she thought she knew about reality was wrong. She ran. Not consciously, not with any plan, just pure instinct taking over and sending her bolting for the library door. She expected him to chase, expected to feel his hands on her or his breath on her neck, but he didn't move, just stood there with those glowing eyes tracking her flight with an expression of such profound pain that even in her panic she registered it. She made it through the mansion on muscle memory and adrenaline, found the front door and wrenched it open, ran down the steps and along the winding driveway with her heels clicking against the pavement and her breath coming in gasps. The gate loomed ahead, wrought iron and at least 10 feet tall, and she grabbed the bars with shaking hands and looked back at the mansion glowing with warm light against the dark forest. Damien was standing on the front steps exactly where she'd left him, not chasing, not hunting, just standing with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed like he was waiting for execution. The rational part of Elena's brain kicked back online, cutting through the panic, and she realized that if he'd wanted to hurt her, he could have done it a dozen times over the past 2 weeks. Could have done it in the restaurant hallway, or in his office, or in the car, or at any point tonight. He'd had opportunity and access, and she'd been alone with him multiple times, and he'd never been anything but protective and respectful, even when she could see the hunger in the way his eyes tracked her pulse. She wasn't afraid of him, she realized with startling clarity. She was afraid of how much she wanted to go back, how much the idea of forever with him appealed, even though forever shouldn't be possible and vampires shouldn't be real. Her mother was dying. She'd spent 2 years watching cancer eat her from the inside, had prayed for miracles she didn't believe in, had raged against a universe that was random and cruel and offered no second chances. "And you're telling me magic is real," she heard herself say to the empty air, "that impossible things exist." "Yes," Damien's voice carried from the steps, impossibly clear across the distance, and Elena turned to look at him fully. "Then tell me this," she called back, her voice shaking but determined. "Can you save her?" She watched him go very still, watched his glowing eyes dim back to human brown, watched his shoulders slump with what looked like relief that she was talking to him, even if the question broke his heart. "Vampire blood can heal many things," he said, his voice carrying that careful precision he used when choosing words mattered, wounds and illnesses, and even some cancers. "But it's not healing, Elena, not really. The transformation is death and rebirth, and becoming something other than human, and I cannot make that choice for your mother. That decision has to be hers and hers alone." "But I could ask her," Elena said, already knowing the answer, already seeing the path forward. And Damien nodded slowly. "Yes," he confirmed, "you could ask her, and if she chooses transformation, I would do everything in my power to ensure she survives the process. But you need to understand what you'd be asking her to give up: sunlight and aging and mortality, and everything that makes her human." Elena's hands loosened on the gate bars, her panic subsiding into something more manageable, something like wonder mixed with terror, mixed with desperate hope. "I won't hurt you," Damien said into the silence. "I would destroy myself first. I have wanted many things over 2 millennia, but I have never wanted to be safe for someone until you." The vulnerability in his voice undid something in Elena's chest, made her remember the way he'd looked at her in his office, the way he'd held her while she cried, the way he'd given her $75,000 and asked for nothing in return. "Prove it," she said, walking back toward the mansion with steps that were slow but steady. "Tell me everything. No more secrets." She watched relief crash over his features like a wave, watched his supernatural control slip enough that his hands were shaking when she climbed the steps and took them in hers. They ended up in the kitchen of all places, a surprisingly modern space that Damien explained was his one concession to the current century, because even vampires appreciated good appliances. He made her tea, his movements precise and careful, like he was afraid she'd spook again, and they sat at the marble island while he told her everything. He'd been born Damien Cassius Thorne in Rome, the youngest son of a senator, had been turned at 28 by a vampire who'd seen potential in his tactical mind and ruthless ambition. He'd spent the first century learning control, the second building power, the next 18 consolidating his position until he ruled the North American covens with a mixture of fear and respect and carefully calculated mercy. He'd seen the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity, had watched the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars, had accumulated wealth beyond measure and knowledge that would rewrite human history. He fed from blood banks now, hadn't killed a human for food in over 300 years, and the supernatural world had rules and politics and complications that made human governments look simple. Vampires could be killed, but it was difficult, required decapitation or fire or sunlight exposure, and they could turn humans through an exchange of blood and will, though the transformation killed more often than it saved. The mate bond was rare even among vampires, he explained, a recognition of compatible souls that transcended species, and from the moment her jasmine scent had hit him in that restaurant he'd been fighting, instincts that demanded he claim her regardless of her wishes. "I've been trying to court you properly," he said with a wry smile, "to give you reasons to choose me that aren't based on supernatural compulsion or financial desperation. But the bond grows stronger every day, and my control grows thinner, and eventually something had to break." Elena listened to all of it, asked questions about logistics and history and what it meant to be a vampire in the modern world. And Damien answered everything with an honesty that was almost painful. He showed her the rest of the mansion, narrating the history of objects as she touched them with wondering fingers, a sword he'd carried in the Crusades, a painting by Caravaggio that museums thought was lost, manuscripts in his own handwriting from 5 centuries ago. His bedroom was surprisingly sparse, just a massive bed and more books, and when Elena asked why he didn't sleep in a coffin, he actually laughed. "Hollywood got almost everything wrong," he said. "We sleep in beds like everyone else, we can enter churches, garlic is just unpleasant, not harmful, and running water doesn't bother us at all." They talked through the night, Elena processing impossible information, while Damien watched her with those ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. As dawn approached, visible through the kitchen windows as a gradual lightening of the sky, Damien's expression grew tense. "I need to be underground before full sunrise," he explained. "The older we are, the more tolerant we become, but direct sunlight would still burn me. I have a room in the basement that's perfectly comfortable." Elena looked at the growing light, then back at Damien, and made a decision. "Show me," she said, and watched surprise flash across his features. "You want to see where I sleep?" he asked carefully. And Elena nodded, because if she was going to choose him, she needed to see all of it. The basement was accessed through a hidden door in the library, stairs leading down to a space that was part bedroom, part vault, comfortable furniture and climate control, and enough security to make a bank jealous. The bed was massive, clearly custom-made, and Elena found herself wondering if he'd ever shared it with anyone before pushing the thought away. "Thank you," Damien said quietly, "for coming back, for listening, for not running away screaming, which would have been entirely justified." Elena turned to face him, this dangerous, beautiful man who'd just upended her entire understanding of reality. "I'm still processing," she admitted, "and I don't know what this means or where we go from here, but I'm not running, not yet anyway." The relief on his face was profound, and when he reached out to touch her cheek, she leaned into his cool palm. "Sleep," she said gently. "We can figure out the rest tomorrow." Elena brought her mother to the mansion 3 days after the revelation. Maria Martinez, pale and fragile in the wheelchair that Marcus pushed with surprising gentleness, and Damien met them in the foyer with an expression of careful neutrality that didn't quite hide his concern. He'd explained the transformation process to Elena in clinical detail, the exchange of blood that would stop Maria's heart, the 3 days of death sleep while her body rebuilt itself cell by cell, the possibility that she wouldn't survive because cancer-weakened bodies sometimes couldn't withstand the change. The mortality rate was 30%, even in ideal circumstances, higher with compromised immune systems, and Damien had made Elena repeat back the statistics until he was certain she understood what she was asking. But Maria had listened to the explanation with the calm of someone who'd already made peace with death, had asked practical questions about pain and duration and what came after, and when Damien finished, she'd smiled with more life than Elena had seen in months. "I've been dying for 2 years," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "At least this way I get to live to see you happy, to see you find someone who looks at you like you hung the stars." Elena had cried then, great heaving sobs, and her mother had pulled her close with stick-thin arms. "Besides," Maria continued with dark humor, "immortality sounds better than chemo." Damien had prepared one of the guest rooms with medical equipment he'd acquired through channels Elena didn't question, monitors and IV lines and enough blood bags to sustain Maria through the transformation, and he'd been grimly honest about what the next 72 hours would entail. "She'll be in agony," he'd said, "every cell in her body dying and reforming, and there's nothing I can do to ease it, except stay with her and make sure her heart restarts when it's supposed to." Elena had wanted to be there too, but Damien explained gently that watching someone you love in that kind of pain was its own special torture, that Maria would be unconscious for most of it, and that Elena should save her strength for the aftermath when her mother would wake confused and hungry and needing guidance. The transformation started at sunset, Damien biting his own wrist with clinical precision and holding it to Maria's lips, while explaining that she needed to drink until her heart stopped. Maria had drunk with surprising eagerness, her eyes going wide as vampire blood hit her system, and Elena watched her mother's heartbeat on the monitor start to slow, each beep coming further apart until finally it flatlined and the room filled with the terrible sound of the alarm. Damien silenced it with a gesture, his fingers checking Maria's pulse with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this countless times. "She's gone," he said quietly. "Now we wait to see if she comes back." The next 3 days were the longest of Elena's life, time stretching and compressing in weird ways as she paced the mansion, trying not to imagine her mother's body cold and still in the room downstairs. Damien emerged periodically to report no change, his expression carefully neutral, and Elena noticed he never left Maria alone for more than a few minutes, honoring his promise to stay with her through the darkness. The mate bond had been growing stronger since the revelation, Elena increasingly aware of Damien's presence even when he was floors away, feeling his concern and determination and fierce protectiveness like emotions that belonged to her. On the second night, unable to sleep, she'd found him in the library reading a medical text from the 1600s, and he'd looked up with those ancient eyes. "Talk to me," he'd said, and Elena found herself confessing her fears, that her mother wouldn't survive, that this was Elena's fault for asking her to choose between death and monstrosity. Damien had pulled her into his lap with careful gentleness. "She chose life," he said firmly. "She chose the chance to watch you grow and love and create, and that's not monstrous. That's the most human choice possible." They'd stayed like that until dawn, Elena curled against his chest, listening to his unnecessary heartbeat. And she'd realized with startling clarity that she wanted this, wanted him, wanted forever if forever meant not being alone. The attack came on the third night, just after sunset, when Maria's transformation was entering its final critical phase. Elena was in the library again, trying to distract herself with a first edition Austen, when she heard glass shatter somewhere in the east wing. Damien appeared beside her instantly, moving with that impossible vampire speed, his eyes already glowing crimson. "Get to Maria's room," he ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me or Marcus. This estate has defenses, but someone just breached them." Elena ran, her human speed feeling glacial compared to the blur of movement she could hear throughout the mansion. And she made it to the guest room, where her mother lay still and death-pale just as an explosion rocked the foundation. Marcus materialized in the hallway, his usually calm face set in grim lines. "Rival coven," he said shortly. "Someone leaked that the king has a human mate, and they're here to eliminate the vulnerability." He thrust a knife into Elena's hands, silver blade gleaming. "It won't kill them, but it'll slow them down. Aim for the heart or throat. And whatever you do, protect Maria, because if they destroy her while she's transforming, they'll break Damien in ways 2,000 years of war never could." Then he was gone, moving to intercept attackers Elena could hear but not see, and she locked the door with shaking hands before positioning herself between the bed and the only entrance. The sounds of battle were horrifying. Inhuman screams and the crash of bodies through walls, and Elena gripped the knife hard enough that her knuckles went white while praying to gods she didn't believe in that Damien would survive this. The door exploded inward 10 minutes later, wood splintering like matchsticks, and a vampire Elena had never seen lunged through with eyes like coals and fangs bared in a snarl. She didn't freeze, didn't scream, just moved on instinct and drove the silver knife up into his chest with all her strength. The vampire howled, stumbling back, and it bought her 3 seconds before he ripped the blade out and came at her again. "Behind you!" Elena shouted with every ounce of volume she possessed, and Damien appeared in the doorway like divine retribution, his expensive clothes shredded and covered in blood, his face transformed into something utterly inhuman and absolutely terrifying. He moved like violence made flesh, grabbing the attacker by the throat and simply tearing his head off with casual brutality that should have been impossible but clearly wasn't. The body crumbled to ash, the ancient vampire technique for disposing of the dead, and Damien's glowing eyes found Elena with laser focus. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, and when she shook her head, he was across the room in a blink, checking her for injuries with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite the gore coating them. More attackers were coming, Elena could hear them, and Damien positioned himself in front of her and Maria with the clear intention of going through anyone who got close. The next 20 minutes were a nightmare of violence. Vampires pouring into the room and Damien cutting them down with a savagery that proved exactly why he was king. His movements too fast to track, his strength casual and devastating. Marcus appeared halfway through, fighting back to back with his king, and together they created a wall of death that the attackers couldn't breach. Elena saw one vampire slip past their defenses, saw him lunging for the bed where Maria lay vulnerable, and she didn't think, just threw herself between them with the knife raised. The blade sank into the vampire's eye, his momentum carrying them both to the ground, and Elena felt ribs crack as they hit the floor. Damien's roar shook the windows, the sound more animal than anything human could produce, and the vampire on top of her disintegrated into ash as Damien ripped him apart from behind. The silence after was deafening, broken only by Elena's gasping breaths and the steady beep of Maria's heart monitor proving she'd survived the chaos. Damien pulled Elena to her feet with shaking hands, his crimson eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotions he was barely containing. "You should have stayed behind me where you were safe." Elena looked at the ash covering her clothes, the blood splattered across the walls, the ruins of what had been an elegant guest room. "I was protecting my mother," she said firmly. "And you, when that one got past your guard, we're partners, Damien, which means I fight beside you, not behind you." Something shifted in his expression, some final wall coming down. And when he kissed her, it tasted like blood and desperation and relief so profound it made her chest ache. The mate bond surged between them, stronger than ever, and Elena felt his emotions crash over her like a wave, love and terror, and fierce possessive joy that she was alive and his, and choosing to stand with him. Marcus cleared his throat from the doorway, his diplomatic way of interrupting, and reported that the attackers were eliminated. 15 vampires from the Western Coven who'd apparently been promised territory if they killed the king's human weakness. "One survived long enough to talk," Marcus continued. "Said a human named Derek Sutton approached them with information about your mate and her vulnerable mother, offered to help them breach the estate defenses in exchange for revenge. Damien's expression went absolutely flat, the kind of calm that preceded extreme violence. "Where is he?" Damien asked quietly, and Marcus's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Secured in the basement, awaiting your judgment." Damien looked at Elena, some question in his ancient eyes, and she nodded once because Derek had tried to kill her mother, and that was a debt that demanded payment. They dealt with Derek swiftly, Damien's justice brutal and final, and Elena found she couldn't muster sympathy for a man who'd allied with vampires to murder a dying woman out of wounded pride. Afterward, they returned to Maria's room, where the heart monitor showed steady rhythm and Damien checked her vitals with practiced efficiency. "She's stabilizing," he said with cautious optimism. "The transformation is nearly complete. She should wake within the hour." Elena looked at her mother's still face, at the room destroyed by violence, at Damien covered in the blood of enemies he'd killed to protect them, and made her decision. "Turn me," she said, and watched Damien go absolutely still. "Elena," he started, "you don't have to decide now. You're in shock, and we just survived an attack, and this isn't the time for permanent choices." She cut him off with a hand on his blood-stained cheek. "I'm not doing this because I'm scared or grateful or in shock," she said firmly. "I'm doing it because I want time, real time. Time to paint every painting I never got to create. Time to learn everything. Time to love you the way you deserve without the clock ticking down." Damien's hands came up to cup her face, his expression cycling through hope and fear and desperate longing. "You'll lose the sun," he said. "Mortality, aging, everything that makes you human." "I'll gain you," Elena countered, "and my mother, and centuries to explore this impossible world you've shown me. I'm choosing this, Damien. I'm choosing you, forever if you'll have me." The kiss was answer enough, but he pulled back to rest his forehead against hers. "I'll have you for eternity, and still it won't be enough," he whispered. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Yes," Elena said, and felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like coming home. The transformation happened in Damien's private chambers, a room he admitted he'd never shared with anyone in 2,000 years, and Elena tried not to examine what that meant as he laid her on sheets that probably cost more than her old apartment. He explained the process again, his bite to drain her nearly to death, his blood to replace what was lost. 3 days of agony while her body died and reformed. "I'll stay with you," he promised. "Every moment. You won't be alone in the dark." The first bite was shocking in its intimacy. Pleasure and pain mixed until Elena couldn't distinguish between them, and she felt her heartbeat start to slow as Damien drank with careful precision. When he bit his own wrist and held it to her lips, his blood tasted like copper and power and something indefinably him, and she drank until the world started to gray at the edges. "I'm here," Damien's voice came from very far away. "I won't leave. You're not alone." Then her heart stopped, and the pain began, every cell in her body screaming as it tore itself apart and rebuilt stronger. And Elena would have screamed if she'd had breath, would have begged for death if she could have formed words. Damien held her through all of it, speaking in languages dead for millennia, Latin and ancient Greek, and something older that sounded like music, his cool hands on her burning skin, the only anchor to reality. Time lost meaning, 3 days compressing into an eternity of agony, and then suddenly her heart kicked back to life with a beat so strong she felt it in her teeth. Elena's eyes snapped open, and the world exploded into color and sensation, every sense amplified beyond anything human. And Damien's face was the first thing she saw, his expression transformed by joy so profound it made her newly stopped heart ache. "Hello, my queen," he whispered, and Elena realized she could hear his voice like music, could smell the ancient magic in his blood, could feel the mate bond like a golden thread connecting them soul to soul. "How do you feel?" Damien asked, helping her sit up with careful gentleness, and Elena tested her new body, the strength in her limbs, the sharpness of her senses, the way she could hear Marcus moving 3 floors below and smell rain coming from miles away. "Like I've been living in black and white and someone just turned on the spectrum," she said, testing her new voice, which sounded the same but carried undertones she'd never heard before. She could hear her mother's heartbeat in the next room, steady and strong, could smell the jasmine of her own scent, mixed with something new and powerful, could feel Damien's emotions through the bond, love and relief, and possessive satisfaction that his mate was safe, and his and eternal. They went to see Maria together, Elena moving with the preternatural grace that came with vampire transformation, and found her mother awake and staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "Mom," Elena said, and Maria's head snapped up with vampire speed, her eyes going wide. "You did it too," she breathed. "You chose this." Elena nodded, crossing to take her mother's hands. "I chose him," she said, glancing at Damien, who stood in the doorway looking like he couldn't quite believe this was real. "I chose forever. I chose us." Maria pulled her into a hug that would have broken human bones, both of them laughing and crying, and Damien's quiet voice from behind made them turn. "Welcome to eternity," he said, "both of you, and I promise to make it worth the cost." They spent the next week learning to be vampires, Damien patient and thorough as he taught them control, how to manage the hunger, how to move without breaking things, how to exist in a world that suddenly felt both infinite and manageable. Elena discovered she could paint with preternatural precision, could see colors humans couldn't perceive, could capture light and shadow with an accuracy that made her old work look like crude sketches. The mansion was repaired within days, the damage from the attack erased like it had never happened, and Damien's people came to pay homage to their king and meet his new queen. Elena stood beside him at formal receptions, learning the politics of the supernatural world, and realized she wasn't afraid of the power or the danger or the infinite complexity of vampire society because she had Damien beside her and her mother healthy and time to figure it all out. Marcus became an unexpected friend, teaching Elena the history she'd need to navigate court politics, and he'd smiled when she asked why he was being so helpful. "The king has been alone for 2 millennia," he said, waiting for someone who could stand beside him as an equal. "You make him happy in ways I've never seen, and that makes you worth protecting." 3 months after her transformation, Elena finished her first painting as a vampire. A portrait of Damien that captured something in his ancient eyes that 2,000 years of artists had never managed. Hope and love, and the vulnerable joy of someone who'd finally found home. She presented it to him on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and watched tears she didn't know he could still cry slip down his perfect face. "It's how you see me," he said with wonder. "Not the monster or the king, but just me." "Always just you," Elena confirmed. And when he kissed her, the mate bond sang between them like recognition, like completion, like 2 souls that had been searching across millennia finally finding each other. They stood together at the mansion's repaired windows watching the sunset, Elena's new vampire constitution allowing her to withstand the fading light that would burn Damien for another 1,000 years. Her hand in his, an eternity stretching before them full of possibility and paint and love that would outlast empires.